The day I found a sold sign hammered into the lawn of the beach house my late wife and I built with our own hands was the day I learned that a son can break his father's heart twice. The first time is when he leaves home to build his own life. The second is when he returns to dismantle yours. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 73 years old, and 5 years ago, I discovered that the boy I taught to ride a bike and bait a fishing hook had sold my past, my present, and my future for the price of a mid-level luxury sedan. Have you ever felt the sting of betrayal from your own flesh and blood? That unique, hollow ache that settles deep in your bones when you realize the person you would have died for sees you as nothing more than an obstacle, a relic to be cleared away. I know that feeling. It tastes like salt and rust, the very essence of the beach house my Eleanor had loved so much. For 40 years, that little two-bedroom cottage on the coast was more than just a structure of wood and nails. It was the repository of our lives. I could still see Eleanor on the porch, her silver hair catching the golden light of sunset, a glass of iced tea in her hand. I could hear the echoes of our son, David, laughing as a little boy, chasing sandpipers at the water's edge. Every floorboard, every window pane held a memory. I had driven the 2 hours from the city for my annual spring cleaning, a ritual I had maintained since Eleanor passed. It was my way of keeping her close, of polishing our shared memories until they shone. But as I turned onto the familiar gravel lane, the blood-red sign stood out against the pale green of the sea grass like a wound. Sold for a long moment, I simply sat in my old Buick, the engine idling, unable to process the 3 letters that had just demolished my world. This had to be a mistake, a prank, some terrible misunderstanding. I got out of the car, my knees unsteady, and walked toward the sign as if in a dream. It was real. A local real estate agency's logo was printed at the bottom. My heart hammered against my ribs. I fumbled for my phone and dialed David's number, my fingers clumsy and slow. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice breezy and distracted. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" "I'm in the middle of a meeting, David," I said, my own voice sounding thin and distant. "I'm at the beach house. There's a sold sign in the yard." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a pause of surprise, but the calculated silence of someone choosing their next words carefully. "Oh, right. I was going to tell you about that." He said it so casually, as if he were talking about a change in the weather. "Tell me about what, David? Tell me why there's a sign on my lawn saying my house has been sold." "Look, Dad, it's for the best," he began, his tone shifting into that placating, condescending cadence he used whenever he thought I was being difficult. "The place was becoming a real burden for you. The taxes, the upkeep. You're not getting any younger a burden? The place that held the ghost of my wife, the laughter of my child, the some of my happiest moments, was a burden? You had no right," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I did. Actually," he said, and the coolness in his voice was more chilling than the ocean breeze. "I have power of attorney, remember? We signed those papers after your little health scare last year. It's all perfectly legal. I got a great price for it, Dad. The money is going into a fantastic investment opportunity that's going to set us up for life, us." He said us. He didn't mean him and me. He meant him and his wife, Susan, a woman who had always looked at the beach house as if it were something she'd scraped off her shoe. In that moment, sitting in my car, staring at the testament to my son's ultimate betrayal, something inside me shifted. The grief that had been my constant companion for 5 years didn't disappear, but it made room for something else. Something colder, harder, and far more dangerous. It was the certainty that my son had just signed a warrant, not for my death, but for the complete and utter destruction of the comfortable, entitled life he had built on a foundation of my love and his own greed. He thought he had sold a house. He had no idea he had just declared war on the wrong old man. Let me tell you who Arthur Pendleton was in my son's eyes. A gentle, grief-stricken widower living quietly in the suburbs, subsisting on a modest pension from my 30 years as a high school history teacher. A man who was getting a bit forgetful, a bit frail, a man who needed his savvy, successful son to manage his affairs. A man whose most valuable asset was a piece of real estate that was, in my daughter-in-law Susan's words, a rustic but ultimately dated, Money pit, that was the mask I wore. It wasn't a deliberate deception, not at first. After Eleanor died, a part of me died with her. The world lost its color, and I retreated into myself, into our shared memories. David and Susan stepped in, ostensibly to help. They set up my online bill payments, arranged for lawn care, and brought over casseroles that tasted like pity. It was during this time, about a year after the funeral, that David had presented me with the power of attorney documents. "It's just a precaution, Dad," he'd said, his pen hovering over the signature line. "In case anything happens, it will make it easier for me to take care of things I had signed without a second thought. Because you see, there's a terrible vulnerability in underestimating your own child's capacity for avarice. You never suspect the ones you love of having motives that are anything less than pure." The truth, however, was far more complex. While I'd been a history teacher, Eleanor had been a brilliant and fiercely protective certified public accountant. She'd handled all our finances with a meticulousness that I had always admired but never fully understood. "People see you, Arthur," she used to tell me, "and they see a kind, trusting soul. That's why I have to be the dragon guarding the treasure." I never thought the person she was guarding it from would be our own son. For years, I had quietly subsidized David and Susan's lifestyle. It started small, a loan for a down payment on their first house, a loan I never expected to be repaid. Then came the private school tuition for their 2 children, my grandchildren, Lily and Tom. Then the luxury car leases, the country club membership, the elaborate vacations they posted all over social media. I never said no. How could I? It was my son, and every check I wrote was, in a way, a tribute to Eleanor, a continuation of the comfortable life she had wanted for our family. But people, I've learned, don't see quiet generosity as a gift. They see it as an entitlement. And over the years, their requests became demands, veiled in the language of concern for my well-being. "Dad, that big house in the city is too much for you. If you sold it and moved into a condo, you'd have so much more liquid capital to enjoy your retirement," David would say. What he meant was, you'd have more money to give us when I refused to sell the family home. Their attention turned to the beach house. "It's such a long drive for you, Dad," Susan would chime in during Sunday dinners. "And honestly, the place is falling apart. You should sell it and let us invest the money for you. Let your money work for you." For a change, they saw assets. I saw memories. They saw an investment opportunity. I saw the last tangible piece of my life with Eleanor. On that day, staring at the sold sign, I finally understood. The power of attorney wasn't a tool for my protection. It was the key they needed to open my vault. The story David spun was that he had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to invest in a tech startup with a friend. The returns, he promised, would be astronomical. Selling the beach house was simply a necessary step to secure our family's financial future. He had framed it as an act of filial responsibility, a difficult but necessary decision made for the greater good. He truly believed I was a doddering old fool who would eventually accept his version of reality, especially when he started waving dividend checks in my face. Poor David. He had inherited my trusting nature, but none of Eleanor's financial acumen. He had no idea that my wife, the love of my life, and the dragon who guarded our treasure, had put in place a fortress so ingenious and so legally airtight that his act of betrayal was not just cruel, but catastrophically stupid. I drove away from the beach house that day with a calmness that felt alien in my own body. It wasn't sadness anymore. It wasn't even anger. It was the cold, clear focus of a history teacher who knew that the most important battles are won not with brute force, but with strategy, patience, and a deep understanding of the terrain. I went home, sat down at the heavy oak desk where Eleanor used to work, and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a leather-bound portfolio she had given me a month before she died. "Everything you need to know is in here, Arthur," she'd whispered, her voice weak but her eyes sharp as ever. "Don't open it unless you have to. But if David ever gets ambitious, this is your weapon." I had never opened it. Until now. The file was labeled simply, "The Eleanor Pendleton Irrevocable Trust," and as I began to read the crisp, legal pages, A slow smile spread across my face for the first time in 5 years. My son had sold a house that, in the eyes of the law, he had absolutely no right to touch. He hadn't just committed a moral crime. He had committed a felony. And he had no idea that the confused old man he'd just swindled was now holding the blueprints to his complete and total ruin. The discovery wasn't just about the trust. It was about the depth of Eleanor's foresight. She had seen this coming. She had known our son, perhaps better than I had. She knew his charm was a veneer for his ambition, and his ambition was a hunger that could never be sated. The trust she had created was a masterpiece of legal protection. She had established it years ago, placing the beach house, along with a significant portion of our stock portfolio, into an irrevocable trust. The primary beneficiary was me for the duration of my life. I had full rights to use and enjoy the property. Upon my death, the assets were to be split, with a small portion going to David and the majority being donated to a list of charities she cared deeply about: an animal shelter, a children's hospital, and a literacy program. But the genius was in the fine print, the clauses she had drafted with her lawyer, a sharp woman named Carol who was as much a friend as a legal advisor. The trust documents explicitly stated that the beach house could not be sold during my lifetime unless two very specific conditions were met. First, I had to be declared medically incompetent by not one, but three independent physicians, one of whom was specifically named in the document: our family doctor of 30 years, Dr. Miller, a man who knew I was as sharp as a tack. Second, the sale had to be personally overseen and approved by the trustee. And who was the trustee? Not me, not David. It was Carol, the lawyer. David's power of attorney was a useless piece of paper against the ironclad walls of an irrevocable trust. He had sold a property he didn't own, a property he had no legal authority to transfer. He had, in essence, sold the Brooklyn Bridge. Sitting there in Eleanor's chair, I felt a surge of awe and love for my late wife. Even from beyond the grave, she was protecting me. She was still the dragon guarding the treasure. My first call was to Carol. I explained the situation, my voice low and steady. I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "He did what?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief and fury. "Arthur, that's not just a breach of trust, that's fraud. Wire fraud, mail fraud, and God knows what else. The man who bought the house doesn't have a legal title." "I know," I said. "And right now, I want him to keep thinking he does." There was a pause. Carol was not just a lawyer. She was a strategist. She understood what I was asking without me having to say it. "You don't want to just stop him," she said, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "You want him to walk so far down this illegal path that he can never find his way back. He needs to learn that actions have consequences, Carol. He spent his whole life being bailed out by me, by his mother. This time, there's no safety net." "I see," she said, and I could hear the faint smile in her voice. Eleanor would be proud. "Okay, Arthur, here's what we do. We play dumb. You are the confused, heartbroken father. You let him comfort you. You let him explain his brilliant investment. Meanwhile, I will start gathering the evidence. I'll contact the title company, the real estate agent, the bank that handled the wire transfer. I'll build a case so complete and so damning that by the time we're done, he won't be able to afford a bus ticket out of town, let alone a lawyer." In the days that followed, I played my part to perfection. I called David back, and, with a tremor in my voice I didn't have to fake entirely, I told him I was hurt and confused, but that I trusted him. "I know you've always had a good head for business, son," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "If you say this is for the best, then I'll try to understand." The relief in his voice was palpable. "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd come around. And listen, Susan and I have been talking. That big house is still too much for you. We found a lovely one-bedroom apartment for you in a senior living community just a few miles from us. It's perfect. It has social activities, a meal plan. You won't have to worry about a thing." I felt a fresh wave of cold fury. They weren't just taking my assets. They were trying to put me out to pasture, to contain me in a neat little box where I would be less of an inconvenience. "That sounds thoughtful," I managed to say. The plan was working. David believed he had gotten away with it. He thought his doddering old father had been easily placated. He had no idea that every conversation was being logged, every financial transaction being traced. Carol was a shark. She discovered that David had forged my signature on several preliminary documents, using a digital copy he had from the power of attorney papers. He had lied to the real estate agent, claiming I was in poor health and had authorized him to handle everything. The money from the sale, a cool $12 million, had been wired directly into a new investment account under his name alone. And the tech startup, it was a shell company he had created with a friend from his country club. The only thing they were starting up was a life of unearned luxury. The most painful discovery, however, came from my own investigation. I started looking through David and Susan's social media. There they were, just a week before the sale, on a lavish trip to the Caribbean. Susan was posing with a new diamond tennis bracelet. The caption read, "Celebrating our next big adventure. So proud of my brilliant husband." They were celebrating the theft of my wife's legacy before the ink on the fraudulent contract was even dry. It was then that I decided this couldn't just be a legal victory. It had to be a personal one. It had to be public. David and Susan had built their entire social standing on a carefully constructed image of success and family values. I was going to take a wrecking ball to that facade in front of everyone they cared about. The perfect opportunity presented itself a few weeks later. An invitation arrived in the mail, printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock. David and Susan Pendleton invite you to a celebration of their new venture. It was a party. A lavish party at their sprawling suburban home to toast the success of their new company, and at the bottom, a handwritten note from Susan. "Dear Arthur, we do hope you'll come." It would mean the world to David to have his father there to see his success. Oh, I would be there. I wouldn't miss it for the world. My son wanted me to see his success, and I was going to make sure it was a celebration he would never, ever forget. In the weeks leading up to the party, I became an actor in my own life, playing the role of the gently declining patriarch. I allowed David and Susan to move me into the senior living apartment. It was, as they had promised, lovely. It was also beige, sterile, and suffocatingly quiet. I packed up a few boxes from my home of 45 years, letting them handle the rest. "We'll put your things in storage, Dad," David said, patting my shoulder as movers carried out furniture that held a lifetime of memories. "Don't you worry about a thing." I let them see me as a man defeated, a man succumbing to old age and irrelevance. This was crucial to my plan. An enemy who underestimates you is an enemy who leaves his flanks exposed. I met with Carol several times a week. Her office became my war room. We had everything. A complete paper trail of the fraudulent sale. Affidavits from the real estate agent, who was now cooperating fully after realizing he'd been duped. Bank records showing the flow of money from the sale into David's shell company, and then out again to pay for a new luxury SUV, the diamond bracelet for Susan, and a down payment on a boat. We even had an expert opinion from a forensic accountant confirming the fraudulent nature of the entire enterprise. But Carol had unearthed one more piece of information, a detail so perfectly ironic it was as if Eleanor had scripted it herself. The man who had bought the beach house, a wealthy tech executive named Marcus Thorne, was one of the primary investors David was hoping to woo for his sham startup. David had sold the man a house he didn't own, and was now planning to ask that same man for more money at the party. It was a Ponzi scheme built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was about to come in. "So, what's the final move?" Carol asked, leaning back in her chair a few days before the celebration. "Legally, we can shut him down now. We can freeze his assets, file the charges." "No," I said. "The legal consequences are just one part of this. He needs to face social consequences. He and Susan care more about their reputation than anything else. I want to take that away from them in the most public way possible." I laid out my plan. Carol listened intently, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Arthur," she said when I had finished, "Eleanor would have adored this. It's beautifully brutal." The night of the party, I dressed carefully. Not in the sad old man cardigans I had been affecting for weeks, but in a tailored navy blue suit that I had bought with Eleanor for our anniversary years ago. It still fit perfectly. I looked at myself in the mirror of my soulless little apartment. The man looking back was not the frail, confused father my son expected to see. It was a man who had been pushed too far, a man who was about to remind his son that history is filled with quiet, unassuming figures who changed the course of empires. I arrived at David and Susan's house deliberately late. The party was in full swing. Cars lined the street. Music and laughter spilled out from the open doors. Their house, which I had helped them buy, had been recently redecorated. It was a monument to bad taste and new money, all chrome, glass, and ostentatious art. I saw them holding court in the center of the living room. David in an expensive suit, Susan dripping with jewels, including the now infamous diamond bracelet. They were laughing, accepting congratulations from a crowd of people who looked just as sleek and self-satisfied as they did. I spotted Marcus Thorne, the man who thought he now owned my beach house, standing near the bar, chatting with a small group. Perfect. Everyone was in place. David saw me, and his smile faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised by my sharp appearance. But he recovered quickly, striding over to me and wrapping an arm around my shoulders in a display of filial affection that was utterly nauseating. "Dad, you made it." "Everyone," he announced to the room, his voice booming. "I want you to meet my father, Arthur. He's the one who taught me everything I know about smart investing. In fact, he's the one who provided the seed capital for our new venture. A real visionary." The crowd applauded politely. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. He was parading me around as a prop, the wise old man who had funded his genius. He led me through the crowd, introducing me to his friends and potential investors. "Dad's so proud," he would say. "Aren't you, Dad?" "Immensely," I would reply, my voice even, my eyes meeting his. He couldn't see the storm brewing behind them. He only saw what he wanted to see, validation. Finally, the moment came. David clinked a champagne flute with a knife to get everyone's attention. "If I could have your attention for a moment," he began, standing with Susan by the grand fireplace. "First, I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate with us. As many of you know, Susan and I have launched a new company, Pendleton Innovations, that is poised to revolutionize the data security industry." He went on for several minutes, spewing jargon and buzzwords he had clearly memorized from a brochure. Then he raised his glass. "But none of this would be possible without the support of family. Specifically, my father, Arthur. He recently made the difficult decision to sell his beloved beach house, a place of many family memories, to fund this dream. It was a sacrifice, but one he made for the future of this family. So I'd like to propose a toast. To my father, a man whose wisdom and generosity have made all of this possible." He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with triumph. The crowd turned to look at me, their faces expectant. They were waiting for the sentimental old father to tear up, to say a few words about how proud he was of his brilliant son. And I did not disappoint. I let another man, who had entered the room silently a moment before, make his way to my side. Then I took a step forward. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "It's true, the beach house holds many memories. And it's also true that it was recently sold." I paused, letting the silence stretch. I looked directly at Marcus Thorne. "In fact, the new owner is with us tonight." "Mr. Thorne, a pleasure to see you again." Thorne nodded, looking slightly confused. "However," I continued, my voice hardening, "there seems to be a small misunderstanding. You see, my son is a gifted storyteller. But tonight, the story he's telling is a work of fiction." A nervous titter went through the crowd. They thought this was part of the act, a father's gentle ribbing. David's smile tightened at the edges. "Dad, what are you talking about?" he asked through clenched teeth. "I'm talking about the fact that you couldn't sell the beach house, David, because you don't own it. You never have." I let that statement hang in the air. The silence in the room was now absolute. Every eye was on us. Susan's face had gone pale. "The beach house," I announced, my voice ringing with clarity, "is, and always has been, the property of the Eleanor Pendleton Irrevocable Trust, a legal entity my late wife created years ago to protect our assets." I turned to the man who had joined me. This is Officer Miller of the local police department. And this, I said, nodding to Carol, who had just stepped through the front door holding a thick briefcase, is Carol Albright, the trustee of that estate, and my attorney. The collective gasp in the room was audible. David looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His face, which had been flushed with success and champagne, was now a ghastly shade of white. He stared at me, then at Carol, then at the uniformed police officer standing beside me. The prop had come to life, and it had brought the executioner with it. What is this?" he stammered, looking around at his guests, who were now staring at him with a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. "This," I said, my voice cold and precise, "is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. This is what happens when you commit fraud." Carol stepped forward and opened her briefcase. "Mr. David Pendleton," she said, her voice sharp and professional, "you have been served." She handed him a thick sheaf of papers. "This is a civil suit for the recovery of stolen assets, damages, and a formal complaint filed with the state attorney's office for multiple counts of felony fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse beside me." Officer Miller took a step toward David. "And Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I have a warrant for your arrest." The chaos that erupted was a thing of terrible beauty. Susan shrieked and burst into tears. David's business partners began backing away as if he were contagious. Marcus Thorne, the man who had bought the house, was on his phone, presumably calling his own lawyer, his face a mask of fury. "Dad, how could you?" David choked out as the officer began to read him his rights. "You're my father, and you're my son," I replied, my voice devoid of all emotion. "But you stopped acting like one the day you decided my life's work was nothing more than seed capital for your delusions of grandeur. You see, David, I was a history teacher, and one of the first lessons of history is that overreaching ambition always leads to a great fall. This is yours. I didn't stay to watch them lead him away in handcuffs. I didn't need to. I turned and walked out of the house I'd helped buy, leaving the wreckage of my son's life behind me. The party was over. The truth had been served, colder and more bitter than any champagne. And in the quiet of my car, driving back to my sterile little apartment, I didn't feel joy. I felt the profound, solemn peace of a promise kept. I had protected Eleanor's legacy. The dragon was at rest. The aftermath was as swift and brutal as the confrontation itself. The story of David's spectacular downfall became the talk of their social circle. The charges were serious, and with the mountain of evidence Carol had compiled, there was no escaping them. David's brilliant friend and business partner turned on him immediately, cutting a deal with the prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. Susan, stripped of her assets and social standing, filed for divorce within a month, claiming she had been deceived by her husband's lies as much as anyone else. No one believed her. The house, the cars, the boat, the diamond bracelet, everything was seized and liquidated to repay the money to Marcus Thorne and to cover the extensive legal fees. My grandchildren, Lily and Tom, were the innocent victims in all of this, and that was the one part of my revenge that gave me no satisfaction. Susan moved with them to a small, rented townhouse across the state to live with her sister. I made sure, through a separate trust managed by Carol, that the children would always be provided for, their education secured. They did not need to pay for the sins of their father. David, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 5 to 7 years in a state penitentiary for fraud and embezzlement. I did not attend the sentencing. My part in his story was over. He had written his own final chapter. A few months later, I moved out of the senior living facility and back into my family home. The silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of grief, but the silence of peace. I sold the house in the city a year later on my own terms and moved permanently into the beach house. The sale to Marcus Thorne had been legally voided, and the title was back where it belonged, with the trust. I spent my days walking the shore where Eleanor and I had walked, tending to the small garden she had planted and reading history books on the porch. The house was no longer just a repository of past memories. It became a place of quiet, active living. I reconnected with old friends, joined a local historical society, and even started volunteering at the library, reading stories to children. I was no longer just Arthur Pendleton, the widower. I was Arthur Pendleton, a man living his life. I learned a hard lesson at 73. I learned that love can be a blindfold, and that family is not an unconditional shield against betrayal. But I also learned that within every quiet, underestimated person, there's a reserve of strength that can be summoned when necessary. I learned that it is never too late to stand up for yourself, to reclaim your dignity, and to demand the respect you deserve. My son thought he was closing a chapter of my life. He thought he was putting me on a shelf to be forgotten. But all he did was force me to start a new one, a better one written on my own terms. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and my story is not a tragedy. It is a lesson that you should never, ever mistake a quiet man for a weak one. Behind the gentle smile and the patient eyes, there may exist an implacable strategist just waiting for the right moment to remind the world that true power isn't loud and boastful. It's the quiet, unshakable force of a life lived with integrity. And that is a legacy no one can ever sell. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you? Share your story in the comments below. I read every one. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and the strength of the human spirit. Remember, respect is not a gift you are given. It is a right you must be willing to defend. Thank you for listening.